Section 26 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 7, Chapter 4, Part 3. Relapse was the most fruitful source of relaxation, at least after the first rage of the Inquisition had exhausted itself. It has been already stated that, after reconciliation or abjuration de vehementi, any backsliding was held to indicate that the conversion had been fictitious, that the culprit was impenitent and pertinacious, and that he was to be abandoned to the secular arm without hope of mercy. This was an unvarying principle of the canon law. The Suprema, in a case brought before it in 1536, declared that it could not dispense for that which the law enjoined, and therefore it was powerless to relieve the relapsed from his punishment. Simancas is equally emphatic: the relapsed is to be condemned without hope of pardon. In the first audience of the accused, the inquisitor was required to tell him that, if he would discharge his conscience, his case would be dispatched with speed and mercy, but, if the charge was relapse, the word mercy was to be omitted because no mercy could be shown. Even prompt and full confession was of no avail; the law was absolute and implacable. This severity was greatly enhanced by the elastic definition given to relapse. The reconciled penitent had to walk warily, for any unconscious return to ancestral habits was sufficient to convict him. About 1500 the Suprema decreed that penitents communicating with unreconciled heretics were to be held as relapsed, and all evidence coming before the tribunals was to be scrutinized for proof that would justify prosecution, evidently of those who might chance to be incidentally named in it, and then, if this proved insufficient for conviction, any admission of the accused, not contained in his former confession, could be used to condemn him as a fictitious convert. How this was construed in practice we learn from Simancas, who says that he is considered a relapsed who, after abjuring heresy, talks with heretics or visits them, or makes presents to them, or favors and communicates with them, so that he cannot but be held to do it as a consequence of his heresy. The man who had been reconciled thus lived in unceasing danger that, at any moment, some acquaintance might be tried and convicted, and his name might occur in the evidence as being on good terms with him. Safety, indeed, could only be secured by resolutely isolating himself from his family and his race. It was the same with those who had only abjured for vehement suspicion. The Instructions of 1561 declare absolutely that, if they confess or are convicted, they must be relaxed, for the inquisitors have no power to reconcile them, although they are not truly but only fictitiously relapsed. Still there were some exceptions. Self-denunciation for relapse, it was admitted, required relaxation under the law, but it was argued that such second confession was not really a conviction, for it showed that the penitent was not incorrigible and should be admitted to mercy. Such cases must have been exceedingly rare, but we have seen one in that of Ursule de la Croix, Volume 2, page 572, where, it will be remembered, a third self-denunciation was visited with the stake. Moriscos enjoyed a special exception. The wholesale enforced conversion of the Moors of Castile in 1502, and of the kingdoms of Aragon in 1525, filled the land with nominal Christians, whose baptism served no other purpose than subjecting them to the Inquisition. They were largely vassals of nobles, to whom their services were indispensable, and to subject whole populations to the penalties of a relapse which was inevitable was a prospect that might well stagger the statesman if not the churchman. In the unsparing rigor of the canon law, escape from this was to be sought only in Rome, and, in March, 1510, Ferdinand asked for a bull enabling the converts to avoid the penalties of relapse. The request was doubtless granted, and was followed by numerous papal briefs, issued during the remainder of the century, which bore the shape of empowering the inquisitors general to appoint confessors with power to absolve Morisco penitents with secret absolution and penance, even if they had relapsed repeatedly, or to proclaim terms of grace, during which absolution could be had irrespective of relapse, together with other devices, the futility of all which we shall see hereafter. This was but one of the many attempts to solve the increasing difficulties of the Morisco problem, and its only relation to the general policy of the Inquisition is to prove how easily, when sufficient motive existed, the unsparing cruelty of the canon law could be set aside. Under that law we can readily conceive how large a portion of the executions were due to relapse. Details are lacking as to the earlier period of activity, but the later records are sufficient to indicate how efficient an agent it was in procuring victims. In the great Madrid auto of 1680 there were 18 Judaizers relaxed in person, of whom 10 were for relapse, 6 for pertinacity, and 2 for denial or imperfect confession. In the terrible Mallorquin autos of 1691, all the relaxed, 38 in person and 7 in effigy, were condemned for relapse, having been reconciled in 1679, and of these only 3 were burnt alive as pertinacious. At the Granada auto of January 31, 1723, of the 11 Judaizers relaxed, all were relapsed. At that of Cordova, April 23, 1724, 7 out of 8 were relapsed, and the same was the case with all of the 6 relaxed in the Cuenca auto of July 23, 1724. In these last 3 autos only 1 person was pertinacious, the rest all professed contrition and conversion, and would have escaped with reconciliation instead of strangulation, had it not been for the rigor in the treatment of relapse. A case already alluded to exemplifies this, and is worth relating in some detail, if only for its psychological interest. Fray Joseph Diaz Pimiento was born in Cuba, of Old Christian parents, in 1687. He was bred to the Church, and his life was an example of the license pervading the colonies. He drifted around the shores of the Caribbean, involved in all kinds of disreputable adventures. In Mexico he forged a certificate of baptism in order to obtain ordination under age. In the Dutch colony of Curaçao he professed conversion to Judaism and was circumcised, in the hope of getting a few $100 from the Jews. After incredible hardships he fell into the hands of the Inquisition of Cartagena de las Indias, where he recanted, was reconciled, and was sent to Spain for reclusion in a convent. While confined in the episcopal prison he broke gaol, but was captured at Jerez, and was put in a convent, heavily fettered, where he endeavored to get assistance from some New Christians who were under suspicion, but in this he failed, although to excite their compassion he wrote to the commissioner of the Inquisition that he was a Jew. Then again he escaped and fled to Lisbon, where he worked for a Dutch shipmaster, who promised to carry him to Holland, whence he could sail for Jamaica. Then a sudden impulse took possession of him, which carried him to Seville, where he presented himself to the Inquisition. At first he professed to be a Christian, but after a few days he told the alcaide that he was a Jew, and in this he persisted, stubbornly refusing to make defence. Necessarily, as a relapsed, he was condemned to relaxation in the auto of July 25, 1720, and, during the 3 days prior to the auto, all the learning and piety of Seville were enlisted in his conversion, while prayers for his soul were put up in all the churches. Then came another revulsion, and, after 2 days, he announced that the grace of God had touched him, and that he was a Christian. But for his relapse this would have saved him. As it was, it only obtained for him preliminary strangulation, and this he sought to reject, for at the stake he begged to be burnt alive in order to prove that his conversion was the result of conviction and not of fear. This could not be permitted, and the deputy assistente sentenced him to be garroted and burnt and his ashes scattered as usual. The pile was fired at 5 P.M. It took until daybreak to reduce the body to ashes, and it was observed that the customary stench was absent. Then the Hermandad de la Caridad asked to have the ashes to give them Christian burial, as he had died a Christian, but the assistente refused and ordered them to be scattered over the fields, in obedience to the royal pragmaticas and apostolical constitutions, all of which, we are told, was done, to the great honor of the Holy Catholic faith. Yet, notwithstanding the canons that prohibited mercy to the relapsed, and withheld, even from the inquisitor general, the power to pardon, cases, as have been stated above, are not infrequent in which the relapsed were admitted to a second reconciliation. Even as early as 1486 we hear of Miser Gonzalo de Santa Maria, of the great Converso family of Burgos, who was thrice penanced by the Inquisition, and who finally died, not at the stake, but in gaol under a sentence of perpetual prison. Some scattering cases of penances subsequent to relaxation occur at Barcelona between 1491 and 1502, mingled with others in which the full penalty of relaxation was inflicted, though no reasons are alleged for the distinction. In 1511, at Cuenca, Leonor and Juana Rodriguez, who had been reconciled in time of grace, were reconciled again for fresh delinquencies. In the later period, instances of the same benignity occur more frequently, although accompanied with punishment severe enough to show that the trivial evidence required to prove persistency was far exceeded. Thus, in the Toledo auto of December 27, 1654, Gaspar de los Reyes was sentenced, as a relapsed observer of the law of Moses, to abjure de vehementi to 6 years of galleys and a fine of 1,000 ducats, while his wife, Isabel Rodriguez, and his mother, Maria Lopez, both relapsed, had the same sentence, save that exile replaced the galleys, and the fine was 600 ducats each. A more unusual case was that of Manuel Rodriguez Moreira, who was relaxed for relapse in the Toledo auto of September 8, 1704, after rejecting an offer of mercy. There is even an instance, December 8, 1681, of a sentence of reconciliation, citra panem relapsi, without the punishment of relapse, but this is explained by the tender age of the culprit, Diego de Castro, who was but 10 years old. Remembering the prudent intimation given to inquisitors that sometimes fines were more productive than confiscation, the heavy mullets inflicted on the relapsed who were admitted to mercy suggest that possibly there may have been financial reasons, in special cases, for benignity. We have seen the number of executions for relapse in the Mallorquin autos of 1691. Besides these, there were 22 cases of those who had been reconciled in 1679 who were not relaxed, but penanced in various ways, including fines ranging from 1 to 500 libras, and aggregating in all 6,500 libras. It is difficult not to recognize in this a speculative exercise of rigor or mercy. As the 18th century wore on, it would seem that the canonical penalty of relaxation came to be enforced only on the relapsed who were pertinacious, or refused to confess and beg for mercy. In the Valladolid auto of June 13, 1745, there are 3 illustrative cases. Luis de la Vega, who had been reconciled in 1701, was relaxed as an impenitent relapsed, who persisted in denying his guilt. Miguel Gutierrez, reconciled in 1699, and Francisco Garcia, reconciled in 1706, were admitted again to reconciliation with irremissible prison and sanbenito, 10 years of galleys and 200 lashes, a somewhat doubtful mercy, but, if the sentence was justifiable, the offence unquestionably under the canons called for relaxation. It was only in formal heresy that relapse entailed relaxation, for, as we have seen, the stake was reserved for heretics. Where heresy was merely inferential, as in bigamy, blasphemy, solicitation in the confessional, reading prohibited books, and other offences reserved to the Inquisition, relapse was treated only as an aggravation, to be punished with such additional severity as the circumstances might indicate. Even relapse in the crime of administering the sacraments without being in orders, which the Roman Inquisition treated as the equivalent of heresy, was visited in Spain only with the ordinary penalties, in somewhat rigorous measure. Thus Juan Vicente Esquirel y Morales, a man with a number of aliases who had been a foot soldier, was penanced for this offence at Granada in 1727. He persisted in his evil courses and, in the Cordova auto of March 4, 1731, he was forbidden to wear clerical garments and was sentenced to 200 lashes and 10 years of galleys. The latter half of the 18th century witnessed the gradual disappearance of relaxation. Llorente tells us that during the reign of Carlos III, 1759 to 1788, he has found accounts of only 10 autos de fe in which there were but 4 cases. Probably the latest instance was that of Isabel Maria Herraiz, an impostor known as the Beata de Cuenca, who died in prison without confession and, being thus unable to recant and beg mercy, was burnt in effigy in 1802. When it came to relaxing a living fellow creature, however, the Inquisition by this time was honestly desirous of escaping the necessity. Padre Miguel Sorano, cura of Esco in Aragon, was an unmanageable heretic, who discarded tradition and the Fathers, and held that Scripture was the sole authority. Purgatory and limbo were human inventions; fees for masses were simony; tithes were a fraud; the pope was not the vicar of Christ, and his decretals were mere devices to raise money. All this he embodied in a book which he audaciously submitted to his bishop and other theologians. Tried by the Saragossa tribunal, he was pertinaciously impenitent, impervious alike to argument and threats, and there was no alternative but to vote for relaxation. Then the Suprema ordered fresh testimony to be sought and renewed efforts at conversion, but all proved fruitless and again relaxation was voted. As a last resource the Suprema ordered an investigation into his sanity. All the population of the vicinage was examined, and one doctor was found to say that some years before he had been dangerously sick, which might have affected his brain, and since then he had talked freely of these heretical doctrines. Taking advantage of this, renewed efforts were made to convert him without coming to a vote. While this was in progress he was attacked with mortal illness and, at the end of 20 days, he was told that the end was near. He merely said that he was in the hands of God; he refused all the consolations of religion, and passed away unrepentant in 1805, to be buried in unconsecrated ground, when the Suprema ordered the case to be closed without proceeding to conviction and burning in effigy. We shall see that 20 years later the episcopal Inquisition was less merciful. End of chapter 4. End of section 26.